In 1981, a letter showed up at a police station in Birmingham, England. But the letter was a lie. It was a cruel and clever forgery designed to hide a brutal truth. The man who sent it thought he'd committed the perfect crime, that his little piece of deception had sent investigators on a wild goose chase they'd never come back from. He never imagined that a tiny, almost invisible mistake he made would, 36 years later, tell the truth he tried so hard to bury, and finally reveal his name. Nova Welsh was just 24 years old, a dedicated mother of 2 young sons. Originally from Jamaica, she had built a life for herself in the West Midlands of England. People who knew her described a woman who was full of life, a woman whose whole world revolved around her kids. But in the summer of 1981, that world came to a sudden, terrifying end. In late July, Nova vanished from her apartment almost as if into thin air. When she was first reported missing, the police response was unfortunately dismissive. They figured she had probably just left on her own. This theory seemed to be confirmed when they got that letter, which explained that she was leaving for a fresh start, away from her ex-partner, Osmond Bell, who was the father of her children. It was a convenient story, and for a while, it worked just like its author wanted. It sent the investigation spinning in the wrong direction and provided cover for what had really happened. The case file, full of old reports and witness statements, sat on a shelf gathering dust. The few pieces of physical evidence that had been collected were sealed in bags and stored in an evidence locker. Among them were the forged letter and its envelope, and another item that seemed trivial at the time, a piece of chewed gum that had been used to jam the lock of the cupboard where Nova's body was found. Back then, these items were dead ends. Who had thought to even keep this gum? The fact that they did was pivotal. As one year bled into the next, and then into decades, any hope for justice started to fade. The world moved on. The killer moved on with his life, the shadow of his past seemingly buried for good. He had every reason to believe he had gotten away with it. For 36 years he was right. The silence of the case was proof of his success. But what he couldn't have known was that in labs around the world, science was catching up, and a new generation of investigators was about to pick up that cold, silent case file with a powerful new set of tools. In 2013, more than 30 years after Nova's death, the case was reopened. Their attention quickly turned to 2 items that had been sitting in storage for over 3 decades, the forged letter and that piece of chewing gum. In 1981, DNA analysis was science fiction, but now, forensic scientists could pull a full genetic profile from the tiniest traces of biological material. They decided to test the chewing gum first. It was a long shot. The evidence was old, and DNA can degrade over time. But painstakingly, scientists were able to isolate and extract human DNA from the gum. They had a profile. This was the profile of the person who had jammed the lock to the cupboard where Nova was hidden. Next, they looked at the letter, the killer's instrument of deception. The words were a lie, but the real story was in the evidence. The man who trapped Nova in that cupboard was the same man who had sent the letter to cover his tracks. When the DNA profile from the gum was run through the National DNA database, it returned a single, undeniable hit: Osmond Bell, Nova's partner and an original suspect. The odds of the DNA belonging to anyone else on Earth were calculated at 1 in a billion. The letter he wrote to create a lie now served only to highlight his guilt. Osmond Bell was charged in 2016 and faced trial the next year, nearly 4 decades after he ended his ex-girlfriend's life. He was an old man by then, living a quiet life, likely believing his crime was a secret he would take to the grave. At his trial, the prosecution laid out the incredible story of the cold case. They presented the jury with the evidence that time couldn't erase: the chewing gum that placed Bell at the scene, and the forged letter that showed his attempt to cover it all up. After hearing all the evidence, the jury delivered its verdict. They acquitted him of murder, but found him guilty of manslaughter by an 11-to-1 majority. So much time had passed that it was hard to prove the premeditation needed for a murder conviction, but his responsibility for Nova's death was now a legal fact. Osmond Bell was sentenced to 12 years in prison.